we go. All right, and usually people kind of drift in and out a little bit too, so I'll kind of just get started. So I think most of you have already been to one of these events before, but for those of you who haven't, we kind of meet every month, and it's a chance for early career scientists to kind of get to know some of the more senior seabird scientists that are part of the World Seabird Union, and also to get to know one another and to kind of talk a little bit about career paths and life and things that aren't really covered by the more scientific meetings, which are the Seabird sessions. So this month's guest is Lindsay Young, and she is the executive director of Pacific Rim Conservation, which she also was one of the founding founders of. And I thought it would be great for her to be able to come and talk a little bit about her background, because she kind of took a path that I think a lot of us don't get exposed to, especially when we're, in academic settings doing graduate work and working potentially with people that are in agencies. We don't often see a lot of what sort of an NGO or nonprofit career path actually looks like, and especially not, going out on our own and kind of starting our own organization the way that Lindsay did. So I thought this would be a really good chance for her to maybe answer some questions about how she got to where she was, what are some of the challenges of going kind of the nonprofit route, and what are some of the benefits and the advantages of doing that. So Lindsay, if you could kind of give a little bit of a bio of sort of your academic background and how you ended up kind of where you are with Pacific Rim.
Yeah, so what I actually did is for some of the classes I have taught in the past, I kind of go back and forth a little bit between academia and land management, as well as nonprofits. So I definitely have what I would call a nonlinear career path, and I've had other students ask this. So I have a couple slides that I can show you guys. But first, thank you for inviting me to this. I always enjoy these things, and I had no idea what I wanted to do. But I don't know, until recently, I feel like. So it's totally normal to be in that position. But here, what I'll do is I will share some slides. Oh, it's screen sharing is disabled.
It seems to
okay,
make you can.
Letting me go now.
Okay, good.
Okay. So this was mainly meant for some of my undergrad students a few years ago. They were sort of getting towards the end of their undergraduate degrees and wanted to know, like, what are my options for going into, and why don't I actually know what's going on with my life? So my whole thing is I've had a very non-linear career path. So I was always super interested in animals from the time I was really young. But didn't know that you could actually have a career in zoology or biology or any of this stuff. And so my parents were always encouraging me, go into medicine, just do that. That's what you do if you're interested in biology. So I'm from Canada originally. That's where I grew up. And also lived at home during my undergrad. So I had kind of a different undergraduate experience. But my third year of university, I did a program called Semester at Sea, which is being on a vessel for 4 months, and you sail quite literally around the world. So it's a large one, but this is the view of most of my time for my third year of university was based on a ship, and completely and absolutely fell in love with the ocean and actually with seabirds during that time. So much so that I came back and taught on it as a faculty member in 2018. But what it really set out for me was what my love was. So when we sailed, our first ocean crossing was from Vancouver all the way across to Japan. And what I saw on that vessel were albatross. So I was watching albatross follow our ship. I had no idea what these things were. Like, these were just giant seagulls that didn't seem to actually flap their wings. How is this even possible? And so throughout all the different oceans that we crossed, because we did circumnavigate, we went all the way through Asia and then up through Africa, the Mediterranean, and across the Atlantic, I saw this diversity of birds that spent their whole lives on the ocean. And to me, it was, just utterly fascinating. But, you know, coming back home to all of this, my parents were like, okay, great. So you're interested in birds. What do you do with that? And the answer is I still have no idea. So I moved to Hawaii after my undergraduate degree and got a job doing breast cancer research at a hospital. And really, really enjoyed the research aspect of what I was doing and how in, sorry, my guinea pigs are squeaking, and how in medical research, the topics are actually informed by a need. So in this particular case, you know, Pacific Island women in the population I was living amongst had a prevalence of breast cancer or deaths from it that was actually almost higher than the prevalence of the disease. Basically, it was being diagnosed postmortem. And so trying to find the reasons why they're being diagnosed or not diagnosed at such a late stage was super motivating. But what I really didn't like was interactions with people. That sounds so bad, but I knew I was not going to be really good at having bedside manner or separating myself from what was going on. And so a career in medicine for me was just not going to be kind of in the cards. And so I was still thinking about these birds, specifically these guys. And, you know, it had been a few years at this point, and realized they actually nested on Oahu, the island I was living on. And so I just thought, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to grad school and I will figure it out. So went back to grad school and designed my PhD research around something that I felt was practical. I wanted to find solutions for why these birds were declining. So sort of applying what I'd learned in sort of the biomedical field to how can we solve problems with seabirds today. So my PhD was on population genetics, trying to figure out the source of a colonization event that was happening on Oahu. This is a new colony that we have here, and why these guys were colonizing it, whether they were at different risk for fisheries bycatch compared to other seabirds or other populations of albatross, and then what the demography was. And so during that time, trying to figure out ways to stop their decline, to prevent predation on the breeding colonies, trying to solve all the problems, the agency partners that I would get my permits from, so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources, became interested in the same questions. Like, well, can you implement these solutions that you're talking about? And I said, I don't know, but I'll try. And they ended up saying, well, we'll pay you to try. Like, if you can get this done, if you can build a fence around this colony that keeps out all of the predators, then that would be amazing. And so that was actually my first sort of venturing into contracting work, was helping them to build a predator exclusion fence around Kaena Point, which was my PhD study site. And it worked, and it was wildly successful. And so all of a sudden, other groups, other foundations, nonprofits, as well as agencies started taking notice, saying, well, can you help us solve this problem too? And that became the foundation actually for what I do today. So at the time, my ex-husband and I were both doing the same thing. He had a PhD in zoology as well, and he was working for the federal government. And so we started the organization that we still run today, even though we're not married. We still work well together. And we now have a staff of about 12 people. We have 8 interns. There's about 20 of us. And we do conservation projects throughout the Pacific. So we try to conserve native bird populations. And about 75% of the species we work with are seabirds. And we do this through habitat management, through predator control, and then research. So always coming back to the, is what we're doing working? And that's where we're sort of a hybrid, in that we apply what we learned in our academic settings through our PhD to always collect the data on the outcomes of what we're doing and analyze it and revise it. And if it doesn't work, just being honest about that. So we strive to publish everything that we do. So because most of you are women, I see there's a Thomas in there, who I'm going to assume is not a woman. This happened. So, and it was very planned and wanted, but I have 2 kids, and this is when they were little. They are now 9 and 11. And I just decided, you know, I want a family and I want to do field work, and I will figure out how to make that happen. And that is really the only advice I have for folks, is you can do field work, you can have a family, you do have to have a supportive partner or family structure around to help you, especially if you're traveling or away. But my solution to this with my position was I would just bring my kids. So they have a love-hate relationship with it. At the moment right now, it's kind of hate. Because they have to walk now. I can't carry them around everywhere. But throughout all of this, I had my kids a year after I finished my PhD. They have always been a part of what I do and my fieldwork, and actually a big motivating factor when my job gets hard, which is all the time at the moment, knowing that I'm making it better so that these guys still have something to see when they're older. So the main thing that we work on is actually mitigating the impacts of climate change right now, specifically for seabirds that nest on atolls. So black-footed albatross are one of our focal species. These guys not only nest, 99% of them below 2 meters in sea level, but they like the perimeter of the atolls. So they're right in the most vulnerable spot. In Hawaii in particular, we're losing islands at a really rapid rate. So every single hurricane, every big wave event that comes through here destroys more and more land. So this is where 90% of our green sea turtles breed in the Hawaiian archipelago. And all it took was a single hurricane for that island to disappear. That also displaced 4,000 breeding pairs of albatross at the same time. And so once it's gone, it doesn't come back. And so, you guys are all familiar with seabirds as part of this. These guys are highly phylopatric. They come back to the same area to breed every year, and this displaces them. And they will ultimately find new places to breed, but it might be on another island that's going to wash away, or it might be on an inhabited one where there's all of a sudden a conflict with people. So we've been doing a lot of translocation. So individuals like this, who in the next big storm surge, big wave event, that bird is dead, or at least the chick that's underneath it will be. So we take chicks from the most at-risk part of these atolls, and we move them to a new location to create a new colony. So this is a pretty typical black-footed albatross colony that you're seeing here. And take them away from mom and dad and a pet carrier, bring them by plane if we have access to an airstrip, which is not often, or more commonly by ship. So these guys have often a 10-day voyage to get to where they're wanting to go. And then we bring them to a higher island here on Oahu that's safe from sea level rise, but also has predators. So we essentially remove the predators from the area to create a new colony that's safe from sea level rise, safe from predators, and in an appropriate location where once they start breeding, they'll be able to withstand everything that comes their way. So we've done that with 6 species so far and have been expanding. This is the same guy right here. And this picture actually makes me super sad because this guy we called Griffin. This is from 2017. And Griffin was 100 miles away from coming back to land this year, and he was snagged as bycatch in the Hawaii tuna fishery. So we got his band return, and we're like, oh, he's almost home, and he didn't quite make it. But he loved that decoy. That was his favorite one. So the one, I had this picture in here. Okay, so another thing that we also do is spend a lot of time surveying for rare and endangered species in Hawaii, which here requires a lot of helicopter work. And so this has been sort of my motivation recently, is to get people out of helicopters, because as you can see, it does not always end well. So this was 2 years ago. Our helicopter lost power at 2,000 feet. And I was convinced I was going to die. And I show this in my presentation because, in the last 90 seconds, as we're essentially free falling, I thought that was it. That was the end of my life. There were sort of 3 thoughts going through my mind. It was almost like an automatic thing, the type of thing you see in movies. And the first one was, had I been a good person, which was interesting. And I thought, yeah, for the most part, I've tried to be inclusive, to do the right thing. I felt pretty comfortable with that. And then the second was, my kids. I felt super sad that I was not going to get to see them again, but I knew that they had a great dad and that they would be okay, and that I had been a good mother to them in the time that I had them. And the final thing that was really interesting to me was, had I done good things for this world? And the answer was an overwhelming yes. I was completely confident that I had contributed in a positive way, making our world a better place, primarily through our work, to be honest. And at the end of it, just before we were about to hit, I just thought, damn, I'm not done. I really love what I do, and I know that I'm making an impact, and I know that good things are happening, and I wish I got to do more. And then somehow, even though we landed upside down in trees like this, we were all alive and we were all completely okay. And it felt like this dream where you get a second chance. And so we got out, and the helicopter didn't catch on fire, and we literally walked away from this. Fire department was like, okay, we're bringing in a helicopter to get you guys. We're like, no. No, we're all good with that. Don't send in another one. We will hike this one out. Thank you very much. And so this became really motivating for me that, you know, the last moments I had on Earth, I was happy with what I had actually done. And it also really motivated me to start using drones so I didn't have to do this again. So a lot of the program that we have now is developing the use of both thermal imaging and regular imaging drones in order to survey for seabirds, which is another story altogether. So that is a long and circuitous talk on how I got to where I am today and what kind of motivates me and makes me tick. And I want to hear what it is for you guys. So I will stop sharing and I'm happy to take questions on that. Let me turn this off for one sec. There we go.
All right, so if you would like to ask a question, please go ahead and also introduce yourself so that we all know who each other are. That would also be great.
Hi, I wouldn't mind asking a question if that's okay. My name's Emily. I'm from BirdLife Australia. So it's 5 a.m. for me. I'm a bit out of it, but thanks for the wonderful talk, Lindsay. It was really, really interesting to hear your career path. And I think for me in Australia, we don't have anything like what you're doing. And so I'm really, really interested, in how you developed it. So thank you. I think my main question is probably how your work is funded. So is it from government departments funding you? Do you apply for grants? Do you have like a not-for-profit fundraising structure? Yeah, I'm really curious about that.
So it's kind of all of the above. So I would say probably 2/3 to 3/4 of our funding come from private foundations, and there are several large ones that form the majority of that, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. So the Packard Foundation has a marine birds program that they fund a lot of the work that we do. And then it's also a mix of state and federal contracts. So some of them are just typical fee for service, like the federal government will put out a thing saying, we need someone to do this. And normally it will be a land manager that knows us and will send it our way saying, hey, this is out for bid. And it's open to anybody, but they, you know, strongly encourage us to put it in. So same thing with the state. So it's a diversified funding stream. One thing that I think sets us apart, so we are a not-for-profit organization, is we generally don't fundraise. So I do not chase down rich people and ask them for money. And part of that is because I hate doing it. But it's also that with the fencing projects that we do, so most organizations take overhead on money they bring in. If you're at a university, your university is usually taking anywhere from 25 to 55% overhead, which is huge. It's a huge portion of the money that you bring in. We take in 10 to 15% overhead on top of that. And so when we do a large infrastructure project, like building a predator fence, those might cost anywhere from $250,000 to $500,000. When we add overhead to that, that's, $25,000 to $50,000 that goes towards our reserves or our general operating funds. And that's about the equivalent of what most groups would do with a private fundraiser. And so in a way, the conservation actions that we're doing, because there's that large capital cost, the general funds that come in on top of that are the equivalent of a fundraising arm for us, which means that we're able to avoid it. But that being said, because we're 100% soft money and have to raise all of it ourselves, we have to be willing to kind of switch on a dime. And if we don't have fencing projects like that, then yes, we would hire a fundraiser who would go out and do that. But we really try, in addition to funding, to have everybody on the team contribute to the actual on the ground work. So we don't have any administrative staff. Everyone has administrative tasks that they are expected to do, and we set up systems very carefully to reduce the administrative burden so that you're not spending endless hours asking for a travel authorization or getting permission to spend $20 on a field notebook. And so we ask everybody to contribute a little bit so that we can pay everybody more, not have administrative staff, and have more of that money go towards conservation. And that's been kind of trial and error. I mean, that's not something that we came up with right off the bat. It was trying to avoid having office space, having admin staff, and all all that, keeping our other costs down.
Thanks so much for that. That's really interesting.
I had a kind of follow-up question to that, which is like, you know, if you're in a university setting, you do have people who kind of manage your grants and, you know, do all that stuff for you. What have you found to be sort of, like you said, it was a bit trial and error to get to where you are now. What are some of the challenges of doing that yourself and not having, you know, external people to work on that?
Being good at budgeting and spreadsheets and just keeping track of that, and something that, you know, our accountant very early on when we started, she said, you know, you don't need it right now, but I would strongly recommend that you use QuickBooks, which is a professional online accounting software, because she said, as you grow, it has all of the different features that you need in it. And if you need, you know, additional accounting support or bookkeeping, you can always add that on later, and then it's already in a professionalized system, so you don't have to, you know, spend $20,000 or $30,000 revamping the whole thing. And so even though we started small, we started with a high-end accounting system. And to this day, I still, you know, we have close to a $2 million budget. I still do all of our books myself, and it only takes me a few hours every month because we started everything in an efficient manner. And, you know, once you do that, the second I get a grant, I enter the grant agreement, I enter the budget, I enter whoever has access to that grant from a spending perspective into QuickBooks. And then every month when we go through all of our receipts and our expenditures, you know, we might spend $20,000 or $30,000 a month on the credit card between everybody. And so categorizing all those transactions might take a lot of time, but if they're automatically categorized according to the grant, all I need to do at any given time is literally push a button in that program, and it tells me how much I've spent out of my grant. So I don't have to sit there and, you know, hassle someone in another office or tabulate every single expenditure. So linking it to bank accounts. Anyway, so there's all these little tricks to streamline what you're doing.
Hi, I'm Jenny. I'm finishing up my PhD and thinking about, you know, like continuing down academic or going into nonprofit, which would be ideal. But I was wondering at this point in your nonprofit stage, are you seeking out the collaborations and these construction projects, or is it mostly people are coming to you guys because they've heard of Pacific Rim at this point?
It's about 50-50. So we have a strategic plan where, as an organization, you know, with our board of directors and our staff, we've identified what we feel are conservation priorities. We actively seek out funding to implement those. And then the other half are organizations approaching us saying, hey, we need help with this. So I'd say it's pretty split down the middle. And, you know, just in terms of the stage a lot of you guys are at, being in graduate school is really the ideal time to test something like this out, because you're broke anyway. I mean, you don't have any money. So like any money that comes in as a bonus rather than the other way around. So like framing your reference point is important. If I were to start this, you know, in middle age, it would be terrifying because I have kids and a mortgage and all of that stuff. But when you're still young and testing things out, you can start to do those contracts and not consider anything that comes in as a bonus. If it doesn't work out, there are always, you know, traditional career paths to follow. So yeah, just I guess that note on graduate school.
What about for those who might not necessarily want to start their own nonprofit, but are interested in working for one? I know you have a smallish, but, you know, significant staff under you. How do you kind of decide what positions need to be filled and how to structure it? And what are you looking for when you're hiring people?
That's a good question. In general, we don't hire people unless we have a specific project for them to do. It's rare for us to hire someone that's just like, oh, we need more help across the board. And part of that is because the work that we do is really diverse. It ranges all the way from veterinary care and animal husbandry to like carpentry and construction on fences. And so there's not many people that can fill those roles. We have two of them who are fantastic, who will probably always have a job with us, who fill that role, but they're hard to find. And we rarely advertise. It's almost always through word of mouth and people that we already know. So someone who might work in an agency. I'm also on the grad faculty at UH, and so I try and keep tabs on all the graduate students and interns that are going through the programs there to see who might be good to work with. Because the other thing is what we do from the exterior looks super sexy and enjoyable and high impact. And it's also extremely difficult. So, last week I had 4 days in the field, 2 days of helicopter work. I got food poisoning on day 1, and I still had to do all of my stuff while vomiting through the whole. I mean, that was an extreme example, but I'm like, I'm too shit. It was one of those weeks where, like, if I posted on Instagram, it looks fantastic, and I was literally dying and like could not wait to go back into bed. So I think there's also a disconnect between what the work looks like from the outside and what it might actually be on the inside, which is why we always prefer to kind of hire internally with people that have that experience and or have interned with us and know that they want it. Because I'd say half to 3/4 of our interns, we have a decent sized intern program, decide after it, they're like, this is not for me. Like, we appreciate the experience, but this is not what I was thinking. And that's a really important realization to have too. I mean, that was sort of what I had with medicine and all of that. So knowing what you don't want is just as important too. But I would say trying to get experience with the organization that you're working with or a personal relationship with them is almost always the most important path forward. And a lot of organizations have formalized partnerships. So we have formalized partnerships with Island Conservation, with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and a couple other entities. And if they recommend, like, hey, we've got the staff member who's leaving us, who we can't keep them on, but they'd be great, we would be more inclined to take one of their staff members over someone off the street.
And another kind of technical question, I guess, continuing in that vein, which is, and I know this is different from country to country likely, but I noticed that Pacific Rim started out as a business and switched to a 501c3 nonprofit. Can you kind of talk about maybe the differences between those models and why you decided to switch?
Yeah, so all nonprofits technically start as for-profits. Some of them go to nonprofit status right away. And that was always our intention, to be honest. We incorporated with the intention of transitioning, and we just didn't get around to it for 7 years. And mainly because the work we were doing was exactly the same. We weren't getting killed in taxes, and so we had a little bit more autonomy. We didn't have to deal with the board of directors. But then once we got into a certain income bracket, then we started getting taxed more heavily, and less of that money was going towards conservation. So that was the point that we decided it was more financially feasible for us to be a nonprofit rather than a business. And so we've always, made the same amount of money. It's not that we were making more as a for-profit. We were just getting taxed more once we got bigger, basically.
All right, who else wants to jump in?
What percentage of your time now is spent doing field work versus doing some of the other, like, writing reports, communicating with your collaborators, etc.? Because it sounded like you still do a fair amount of field work, which is impressive, I think, at this stage.
Yeah, the field work is by design for me, and also we're a little short-staffed with our projects on Kauai, so I was over there helping to train up some new staff members. I try and keep my field work to 20%, so basically 1 day a week. Sometimes it's 2 days a week, and then the rest is office-based. So I'd say my office work is, I would spend the equivalent of 1 day a week doing reporting, accounting, grant writing, kind of the administrative stuff. I try and spend 1 day a week on thinking about future projects and project development, like the moving forward aspect of it. And then another day doing the kind of writing and analysis and sort of scientific end of things. I mean, it doesn't always break down that neatly, but if I were to divide my time over a period of a month, that's probably roughly where it goes. We're just in the midst of actually finishing a book. It's due August 1st. It will be Conservation of Marine Birds. And so it has 60 co-authors. There's a ton of people on it, but we'll go over all the different threats to seabirds and all the different solutions worldwide that are being implemented. So basically the book that I wish that I had in graduate school that spelled out all the different things in one volume. So that's been kind of the major writing project we're working on right now. And then just, you know, a couple papers on outcomes for what we're doing.
Is there anything you feel like you wish you had more time for than you currently have? And everything is not acceptable.
I guess the one thing that I feel like I'm perpetually a bad boss, to be honest. I have some staff members that are super independent and prefer it that way. You know, they don't need weekly check-ins, all of that. And then I have some who I know would want to be on the phone like 2 hours a day. And so I feel like I'm never meeting everybody's needs. I tend to be pretty hands-off. And so I'm still figuring out how to be an effective leader in a way that works for me so I can get my stuff done and that also works for and motivates my team, because it's really different for every person. And the more people you have, the more issues come up. Like up until I'd say last year, we were still very small, a very close-knit team. It was really pretty seamless and we could anticipate, everybody anticipated the other's needs. Like we functioned as like a family unit almost. And then with the expansion becomes, you know, there's just growing pains associated with that. So I feel like that's the one area I wish I had more time for. And then the other one, I wish I had more time to get into the writing and data analysis. I mean, I'm trying to, this is sort of my season for it, but I do miss the academic side of being able to dedicate like a week or 2 weeks or whatever it is to just really diving in deep to something. I feel like I only shallowly scratch the surface on a lot of different things.
I had one more question, if that's all right. I'm curious what sort of specific skills you feel like would be most useful for moving sort of into this field. I know you mentioned obviously good budgeting skills is a big one, but yeah, just curious to know what else you might mention.
Budgeting is good. Clear, concise writing, and not necessarily scientific writing, but writing that if you're writing a grant proposal, could your parents or your siblings understand it? Because that's usually who you're gearing it towards. The people receiving those might not be scientists, and so you have to convey that information in a way that's clear as well as convincing. So working on writing and then also just dealing with people. Everyone in conservation generally agrees on the outcome that they want, but they rarely agree on how to get there. And oftentimes they can disagree like vehemently on how to get there. And so being able to work with all kinds of different people. And this sounds weird, but especially when you have a PhD behind your name, it often intimidates a lot of people. So they assume that you're going to present yourself as being smarter or just, you know, more something than them. And so I found being field-based, and usually when people meet me, I'm not in a dress like I am now or just out doing stuff in the field. Reduces sort of the power distance between folks, and that's helpful. So just being cognizant, if you do have the advanced degree, that sometimes that can work against you, even though the skills that you get from it are useful. So yeah, none of that is science, which is probably not what you want to hear when you're getting an advanced scientific degree. But people, budgeting, and writing. And there are tons of great online courses to do all of that stuff and learn how to do grant writing and report writing. And that's something that we definitely struggle with our new employees that have never written a report in their life. You know, they may have had a couple field jobs out of undergrad, and I say, okay, it's time to write out the annual report. And I'll give them a template, and they're like, oh my God, I've never done this before. How do I do this? And the answer is you just practice. So really getting practice in clear, concise writing for whatever it is, like offer, I know this sounds painful, but offer to write a report for your advisor or someone and see what's required of it, and read some of those reports and see what makes a good one and streamlined, what makes it readable, what makes it understandable. And it's not necessarily that longer is better either. So getting experience in that.
I have a question, if it's possible. Sorry, I missed the first probably 2/3 of your talk. I had to move a sofa. I've just moved into a new apartment. I had to move a sofa.
Introduce yourself.
A lot
you
further.
probably missed
So
that part.
I'm Tommy. I'm Tommy, and I'm a postdoc at UC Santa Cruz. So I've actually just moved to Monterey from the UK. So I'm just getting set up in the US. I work on albatrosses and petrels, and now whales. So I don't know if you said this towards the beginning of your talk, but I was just wondering what kind of building on what other people said, like what is the main constraint in like achieving your conservation outcomes? Like, is it funding or is it people? Like kind of, is there like a cultural side that's kind of preventing change, or is it like politics? Like I'd be interested to see kind of how much it's like a research issue or a funding issue, or like a kind of like a people issue.
I'm going to totally cheat. So I'm working on another talk right now for another presentation I'm giving this week. And this is the question you're asking. So our number one issue is funding. And this is a paper that we're almost completed with, which are the threats to different taxonomic groups in Hawaii. And so we polled basically folks that work on invertebrates, plants, and vertebrates. And in the case of Hawaii, vertebrates means birds because we don't have any other native ones. If you look, we know exactly what the primary threats are. There's very little in the unknown category. So we know exactly what the issue is. And then in terms of action, same thing. For the vast majority of them, we know what the solution is. It's not that there's some that have unknown solutions, but for vertebrates or birds, 95% of the species in Hawaii, we know exactly what to do. This is a funding gap. It's not a knowledge or technical capacity. And in most cases, it's not even a political will. It is just 100% funding. So that is where we, kind of why we almost exist as a nonprofit, because the agencies know what to do as well. And they just don't have, sometimes they don't have the capacity in-house in Hawaii specifically, because it's a very transitory community. It's a whole other issue, but yes, it is a funding issue.
Cool, thanks for that. I was just building on that. Do you find it's more effective to just focus all of your funds on one conservation outcome, or is it better to like spread out and just kind of try and progress kind of progressively with kind of various issues? I mean, I guess it depends on the threat, right? But
yeah, so the main threat for island species in general, and most seabirds nest on islands, are predation from introduced predators. And that's the same across all taxonomic groups within Hawaii. And so if we do interventions that focus on that, that benefits all of the species. And then that helps you to tap into different funding sources for different taxonomic groups. So in the case of Hawaii, it's predation from introduced, usually feral ungulates, as well as predators, depending on if you're a plant or a seabird. And so doing things that remove them, which is basically predator exclusion fencing at this point, because our islands are too big to do full-scale island-wide eradications. So getting funding for the predator exclusion fences really helps everything in there. And by using this as an ecosystem-based model, rather than just, oh, we're doing this for one bird species, it increases the value and the outcomes that you can get overall. And that's actually what you want in conservation. You don't want to have single species specific projects. Sometimes you sell them that way. Like albatrosses are really easy to get people on board as an ambassador species. So that's often what the funding is justified for from specific funders, but ultimately the whole project is about the entire coastal ecosystem. So the one that I introduced earlier at James Campbell, where we translocate black-footed albatross, that's a 16-acre fence that wildlife refuge had 0 nesting seabirds 5 years ago, and now it has 1/4 of the nesting seabird species in the state of Hawaii. And that's not just because of the translocation, but also the social attraction. So it's functionally brought in a whole suite of species, and at the same time, endangered invertebrates are now being detected, and we've outplanted endangered plants. And so it all kind of ties in together. We try and have a bit more of a holistic approach, even though we're all about birds.
So since your organization is very sort of hands-on, very focused on restoration, it seems like there's a lot of potential to kind of get into political and legal issues that you might not sort of have a lot of background in, and knowing that you're sort of not a people-focused person to begin with, which I'm sure is true of many of us. How have you kind of handled that side of things? And I guess on the positive side, sort of media attention and, you know, the kinds of interest that these kinds of projects generate.
Yeah, that's a good question. So as a nonprofit, we have a board of directors that essentially governs the leadership and direction. You know, they're essentially my supervisors, and half of our board of directors are attorneys. And so that helps us on the legal end because we do get involved in a lot of wildlife enforcement issues, land use issues. We do get asked to lobby on occasion, which we generally don't do. But they're really good at being able to keep us out of trouble and to help move things forward and advise on things like that. And then in terms of media, that has been a constant struggle. Our organization is in the media a lot, which in general is a good thing, but that's something that I don't feel super equipped to deal with. I do have, and this is, you know, one of the benefits of having kids is you meet people outside of your circle. And so one of the women that I met at my kids' preschool years ago is a public relations officer. And like she has a public relations firm, and I have coffee with her once a month. And so she does some pro bono work for us and helps us, you know, filter some of that, or just will say like, hey, here's how you should deal with this. So trying to have a broad circle of friends with different areas of expertise is super helpful.
So more of a kind of seabird conservation question. Where do you see, like, you know, the kinds of projects that you're doing now going over the next decade or several decades?
Oh gosh, I think I would have had an answer for that before COVID, but I feel like that stuff's so up in the air. To be honest, things are changing, at least in the tropical islands that we work in, just so rapidly. You know, these places that I've been visiting every year for the last, you know, close to 20 years at this point, the rate of change is just astronomical. And it's sort of one of the benefits of having had the same study sites for such a long period of time. And you can not only quantify it, but you just see it every year. That photo I showed of the black-footed albatross chick, and there's like the parent, there's this like pipe sticking out. That was 2 years ago, and that pipe is now 15 feet out over the beach. So the sea level rise and change is a huge issue. And so I think, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because translocation and moving species around should always be a last option. I think that's going to become more and more commonplace. You know, we're starting to work off the Channel Islands at the request of National Park Service, Department of Defense, and TNC, who, you know, co-manage those islands, to translocate albatross there, recognizing that they're in the region. We just finished doing the same thing off of Mexico. So I think there's going to be a lot more of essentially moving birds around to get them into habitat that's suitable, either because their islands are going underwater or because their prey bases, excuse me, are shifting so dramatically that their nesting areas may no longer be suitable. So I think, you know, a lot of the oceanographic shifts that we're watching, there was a huge change in the 2015 El Nino that I don't feel like things have ever been the same since then. And I think that's only going to get worse. So just having to adapt and see if the birds adapt and then how to adapt with them is where it goes. And then scaling up some of the technologies. So predator fencing is great for small areas, but really on a landscape scale, you want to just fully eradicate things. You don't want to fence off, you want to just get rid of it. So working with some of the technologies that are coming out to fully eliminate some of the vertebrate pests on island, I think is going to be the future forward.
Has Pacific Rim worked on eradications specifically?
Yeah, so within the predator fences, we do all of our own eradications, and we've done several small offshore islands. So the stuff I was doing last week, we just finished 2 fences on Kauai. So those are all completely sealed. So we were doing the predator eradication on the inside. So in general, we do, smaller areas that are like 20 hectares in size that are not a big deal. We don't deal with the aerial drops of rodenticides. We do partner with island conservation if we're working with bigger islands. But we do eradications as part of a larger conservation program for a site that's not kind of the sole focus.
And does that run into public resistance in any of those cases?
Honestly, no. And I think it's because of the delivery method. When you're talking about dropping rat poison from a helicopter, it's the helicopter that gets people, not so much the rat poison, it's the delivery method. And in contrast, when we do this on the ground, Kayana Point, which is my study site, we still use rat poison, but we do it in bait buckets, and it's open to the public every day. So when the public sees us walking around with green buckets of bait, they usually thank us. And so I think them being able to see the work on the ground and not having it be this scary, nebulous thing that they see on the news instead makes a huge difference. We live in the communities that we work in. We're not coming in from the outside. And so if they have an issue, they will literally talk to me at like school drop off with my kids. And this is, the other thing I was talking about with children is that you form a network that's much larger than the biology one. Up until I had kids, my only social network was through work. And it has expanded quite a bit, and kids act as sort of ambassadors for that. And so it really cements you in the community and helps you to get your work done, ironically.
That actually reminded me of another question I had, not so much about kids, but about working, sort of being a part of the local community. Do you work with sort of Indigenous Hawaiian groups at all, or other Pacific Islander groups? And how does your organization kind of integrate them into what you do?
Yes, we do. We do work with several different Native Hawaiian groups, and the land that we work on, originally was all owned by Hawaiians. A lot of the birds that we're bringing back into the main Hawaiian Islands from the Northwestern Islands don't have Hawaiian names. So we work with Office of Hawaiian Affairs to give them Hawaiian names. And up until COVID, we had a pretty active outreach program in the immediate communities around the reserves we work in. And usually those reserves are in the kind of lowest income parts of the area. So we would bring literally every school kid from the public school system within a certain mile radius to those sites every year. And so we're pretty conscious of trying to involve them, even though, we don't have a ton of diversity on our staff. I have no illusions that we're representative of the population here. And that hasn't necessarily been intentional. It is more that there's not as many people going into conservation. So we're trying to make an effort to change that. And that's part of why we have the internship program. But yeah, it's unavoidable in Hawaii. And really in many other places, just integrating that is really pretty critical.
All right, other questions / comments? Okay, I'll give you one final one. What has been the most fun and the most challenging aspects of having kids out in the field with you?
Gosh, the most challenging, sorry, Tommy, was when they were super young and just breastfeeding and pumping while you're in the field. I mean, I did a multi-day stint on Lake Hua, which is this tiny little rock, and it's really hot. And part of my breast pump fell off the cliff into the water. I'm like, oh, this is gonna suck. And it was me and a bunch of dudes. I'm like, I've got to go get that out of the water, or we're all going to be really unhappy here. And so my male field colleagues helped me snorkel for my breast pump. So I'd say that was the most challenging. But the most fun is, as my kids have gotten older, they realize they've had a totally abnormal childhood, and that they're kind of proud of that. And so when they go to school and they're like, oh, my mom's a nurse, and my daughter will say, like, my mom jumps out of helicopters to save birds. And I get to come with her, not in the helicopter part. but they have a sense of pride and they know that we're doing stuff to make it better for them. So they really start to get it, and that makes me happy. But it's definitely not without challenges.
Right. Well, if there are no more questions, then we will be meeting again toward the end of it next month. So take a look at Twitter and the website for details. And once again, thank you so much, Lindsay, for being here. It was really great. I've kind of always wondered about, how you got to where you were, and it was very
Really intentionally.
more about that.
And to all of you, Juliet, I don't know if Pat's told you, but I am probably your new incoming chair for World Seaward Union. And I am interested in having this be a younger organization. The Seaward World has, at least as long as I've been in it, has always been kind of the old boys club. And it was super intimidating when I was a young graduate student to get into that. And I would like to change that and have it be more inclusive. And the questions that you guys are having about how to do budgets or grants and all of that, start to have actual workshops on the non-science skills that would be helpful towards career paths. So if you start to think of anything, please feel free to email me. I'm trying to think of ideas for how we can make this not only more inclusive, but just more practical for people to get stuff out of.
Yeah, we've had other early career meetings where people have kind of said the same thing, that they'd like to have, those kinds of practical workshops and potentially have them available over, YouTube or, on recordings that they can refer to. And it's kind of just something that's never really, gotten going, but there's definitely interest.
Yeah, and I think, to be honest, most folks that chair an organization are usually in academia, and they might not have the experience in doing that stuff. So it could be related to, and they're also just super busy with their own things. But yeah, so if you guys think of anything as World Seaward Union starts to evolve, I'm happy to include that.
Could you maybe put your email in the chat?
Yeah. It's too long. Yeah, the other thing is, if you're coming up with a name for your organization, don't have a website that's like 15 characters long, because it's super irritating to type in an email like that every single time. Advice that I wish I had: abbreviate your website name. Did I even spell it right? I did.
All right. Well, I hope everyone has a good rest of your day, although most of you are probably earlier. Oh no, Emily's very early. But anyway, take care, and great to see you all.
All right, you too. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Okay, bye.